About 2 weeks ago, on November 28th, 2024, Proxmox has released PBS, a Proxmox backup server version 3.3, with some relatively large and exciting changes for a smallish dot release. So I've done some testing, played around with some of my own hardware, and just going to go over some of my thoughts. And in addition to this, a week before that, they released Proxmox Virtualization version 8.3 with some of the same features and some of its own new features. So I just want to go over some of the features, test some of what the more exciting things to me were, and just kind of go over my whole thoughts of how they've been evolving the platform and some other ideas I had. So let's dive into that now. All of the information involving these new releases is on their website right now, and they have some nice forum pages as well as wiki pages that goes over almost all of the different changes they've made. But some of the more exciting top-level things in PBS includes the push direction for sync jobs, removable data stores, so now you can just unplug and unmount a data store easily in a supported manner. There's a new webhook notification target for PBS and PVE, and there's a new metadata system that should speed up container backups as well as some file backups you can run on your system. Proxmox Virtualization has a lot of those same changes, like the webhook things, in addition to some other nice features like being able to more easily import OVF backup imports, in addition to some other Proxmox Virtualization specific changes like more easy OVF import options and better SDN integration. But in my opinion, PBS was the more exciting one out of these two because of those rotated backups and easily adding and removing of backups. So that's what I'm going to dive into more in this video. Also, both of these pieces of software are based off Debian and a lot of other open source software. So for example, they have gotten Debian 12.8 under the hood as the OS and utilities it's all based off of, kernel 6.8.12 with an available kernel 6.11 if you want to upgrade to that in the repositories. ZFS has been updated to 2.2.6, which is nice that ZFS has a new version, but unfortunately isn't ZFS 2.3, which supports RAID Z expansion. And on Proxmox Virtualization, a new version of QEMU version 9.02, and LXC6 is in this release now. I did a quick glance through a lot of this third-party software they updated, and nothing looks extremely exciting to me, but it's a lot of small bug fixes, security improvements, and likely with things like kernels, they've significantly improved driver support for new hardware if you're using that in your system. And if you are using latest hardware, I'd recommend looking into the new 6.11 kernel, as typically new Linux kernels support new hardware much better. Also, since this is a dot release, it should be a pretty painless release without any major issues. If you're running something like a Proxmox cluster or backing up the PBS systems, generally if they're off by a release or two, especially a small dot release, you're not going to have any issues, so you can upgrade your nodes all one by one without any issues. And you can also do something like update to a new version of Proxmox backup server before updating to your virtualization or vice versa. You should generally be able to update these systems using apt update and apt upgrade in the terminal, or if you're using the GUI on these systems to update, you can go under updates, refresh the list of possible updates you might want to see on your system, and then go under upgrade to upgrade all the packages on your system. Then you'll likely want to reboot, as it forces all the services to restart and lets you run the latest kernel. And I like to check in the top left just to make sure it is running the correct new version and everything's working correctly. My mindset with these smaller upgrades is that almost all the time the system updates and then can be rebooted within maybe 10 or 15 minutes and generally works fine with no issues. Though I have seen those cases where you do run into issues even after a smallish update, so I like to think that you should probably expect a minimal, easy update, but be ready for a worst case scenario and have recovery plans just in case. And with all of that stuff out of the way, let's dive into the more exciting features that PBS has brought in this release. So the most exciting thing to me is they've added support for rotated hard drives. So now PBS supports a good way of handling rotated hard drives, having it sync your main backups to this repository, and then unplugging it, storing it off-site for some period of time, and then plugging it back into the system to give it the latest updates of backups. And I think this approach can make a lot of sense for kind of a home environment or a small business environment where a rotated solution allows you to store an off-site copy of data, so in case your main location was damaged, that copy of data will be safe. And it's also an offline copy of data, so that way if some attacker was able to get access to all your local virtualization and the backup servers, that offline copy still can't be accessed unless they could somehow reach it physically, which is probably unlikely in most cases. Overall, I think this was done in a fairly painless manner and relatively happy with how it's implemented, but let's actually take a look at how it's implemented right now on this system. So if I take a look at my data stores, I can see my 8TB USB 1 and my Passport 1 are both kind of the rotated storage types. And compared to my main local data storage types, I can see some buttons to unmount and mount it. So let's actually just try doing that now. I can unmount it and actually goes and unmounts it in the command line on this system. I can see that it's now grayed out, says it's not mounted. But if I refresh the page, unfortunately it doesn't cache things like the amount of data stored on the system or what content's on it. That's kind of one of my, I wish it had that feature. And since it's unmounted, I can unplug the drive that was storing the data on the system and store it somewhere off-site. And let's say I'm done storing this data off-site, I can plug it in again on my system. It'll spin up, and it should be able to automatically detect that it's been added again, automatically mount it, and then just start doing syncs. So if you saw right there, it showed and turned back to white instead of gray. If I go into summary, it should be able to show how much data is on there. I can hear it slowly cranking away and start doing syncs. In this case, I set it up to just do sync jobs at certain times. I know it's failing because of my weird PBS configuration, PVE configuration I have going on now. And that's all fine. The one thing I'd probably be careful about is garbage collection and pruning jobs. I wish they'd add an option for when plugged in, but I guess you can run it frequently and it'll just be able to lock it and not really cause too big of an issue. But I'd be cool if there was an auto run when plugged in option they could add. But overall, pretty painless. I'm happy with how this solution works. If you want to go create a removable data store, I can go into storage and disks, plug in, let's say, a USB drive just for testing. I would never recommend using a USB stick for storing backups on, but just need a quick access drive I have here. I can see on my system, I can see my 32GB flash drive, can wipe it, and when I set up new directory storage, that's the device right here. I can set up a certain file system, a name like USB stick, and set it up as a removable data store, and I have a new removable data store on this system. The other neat feature PBS has added is you can now import a data store on a new system. So let's say I have my removable data store full of data, and unfortunately all my on-site backup and virtualization systems have been lost. I did do this in an earlier PBS video where I had some hacky way of kind of making a data store and then secretly adding the path where all the data was, and it would detect it. But now they have a native way to do that, where I can just go under data stores, add data store, and then when I go under Add Data Store and check Advanced, I can say Reuse Existing Data Store, and it'll check for existing chunks and data about where the data is, and I can just use all those backups without having to do my hacky approach, which is really awesome to see in my opinion. One other feature that's listed to being added in PBS, but I actually wasn't able to figure out how to make it work, was being able to do backups of files, like either how a container would be able to do its backup, or in this case, just manually backing up a directory faster by using the metadata to check if a file's been touched since the last backup has been ran. So in this example, and one thing I use PBS for, is backing up my photos. So I just have a little script here that backs up all of my photos onto PBS. And what they seem to imply in these release notes is that it'll check the modified date or other metadata of the file, as it is stored in PBS now, and then compare it and only back up the data it needs. But unfortunately, with my testing, it's not working right. As you can see on the left here, it's reading the data at the full speed of these disks. It's not copying it over the network, but since it knows that that data has already been copied, it's not touching the server at all. It likely works better with containers that have a more standardized to Proxmox way of doing metadata instead of just some file on my server. But I can't seem to get that to go, but if it could work correctly, that means I could back up my data much faster for data stores that don't change that often, which for a lot of incremental backups likely is the case. They also listed some just under-the-hood improvements that make things work faster, and I didn't run any specific speed timings or testing, but this all feels regular PVE to me. It seems like relatively minor improvements that they had to the performance. It wasn't a revolutionary shift in performance. Some of the other things that were added to PVE and PBS in this release involves notifications. They've added webhook support. I should really do a video about doing notifications in Proxmox and making sure you can get notified, but now you can send a post or other HTTP request to your server to get notifications that something's working or not working in PBS or PVE that way. One of the other big features that PBS brought is now you can do push backups when it comes to syncing multiple PBS systems. In previous releases, they could only do pull sync jobs, which means that an offsite system or one that it wants to sync backups to has to pull them from another PBS server. Now for example, on-site PBS server can push its backups to an offsite system. And there's definitely debates on mentalities of which is more secure. It means which system has to hold the authentication and keys for the other node in this world, but it's nice having the option. I can imagine scenarios where maybe if you're pushing from one system to multiple, it's nice having all of those logs initially being in one box, though you still need to monitor your offsite systems. And it should also provide flexibility when it comes to which side is having to be port forwarded if you're pushing or pulling, which can make it a little bit easier if you're using maybe home networks or low-grade business networks where you don't have public IPs that you can easily access to on both ends. When it comes to its implementation within Proxmox, when you go under repository, now in my PBS test, and go under sync jobs, you now have multiple options. The pull sync job is the default and has an option for doing local syncs between multiple internal repositories. And the push backup now that's added allows you to sync from your local PBS server to some other PBS server with its own repositories, and you can set it up. There's a little bit of caveats when it comes to permissions and making sure that's set up all right, but check the wiki for more information. It's great to have the additional option, and let me know if you use that in your configuration or if that helps you out. And overall, for a small dot release, this seems like a good amount of features that I'm relatively happy to see that PBS keeps adding things and makes it look like a pretty resoundingly good backup solution. And there's many times that I've definitely enjoyed using PBS because it's relatively snappy, pretty efficient on space, and I think it's just generally been pretty reliable in my use with minimal weird errors, which is kind of the best case scenario for backup software. One of the other things that PBS has impressed me with is they've had this roadmap list of things that they've wanted to add to the system to make it better, and they've basically checked out almost everything here. The couple items that are left includes doing an S3 or object storage backup solution, because currently PBS doesn't have a great way to use most cloud storage like S3, and because it's pretty resource heavy when it comes to checking metadata of files, can lead to a lot of costs if you're using something like S3 to store your backups by just mounting it on your system. The other thing that they've mentioned is Proxmox VE host backup, and in forum posts, the Proxmox team doesn't have any hard date on that. And I've actually thought about how I might set up my own solution and decided that it's not worth my effort to try to build my own because it gets really complex quickly depending on how you're trying to do it. Because oftentimes you might want to use features like ZFS snapshots, but the problem is people don't always use ZFS in Proxmox, and if you're using something like LVM, that's a whole different way of doing snapshots, or you could just use an ext4 file system on top of a GPT partition table where there's no snapshot support, meaning either you have to design your backup solution for the lowest common denominator, which means no snapshot-like functionality, or design it for snapshots and have to write it multiple ways. I'm curious if they're going to do a full disk backup like that, or maybe they're just going to do a Proxmox config backup. So then once you do a basic install, you could maybe upload a little Proxmox config file from PBS, and it'll restore all of your Proxmox settings and maybe VM settings or other things on the host. While I get the mentality that you can just back up all your VMs and restore them, if you're in a small environment and maybe all of its drives dies or the system somehow got damaged and can't boot, there's definitely times that restoring all of its config would be a lot easier than having to go and restore every VM separately and try to recreate your configuration from memory or whatever documentation you had. They also list support for backup clients for other operating systems. As I demoed earlier, you can do backups via things of files in Linux, but having something where you can back up Windows might make it a pretty good system if that worked well, along with Mac systems. I could definitely see an argument for basic file backup and would love to see a full disk bootable utility, but I get that does increase scope quite a bit for a backup piece of software. The other thing I'd like to add to the roadmap is to change the locking system so that one Proxmox virtualization system can back up multiple VMs at the same time. Because currently, if you have PBS running, it runs one VM backup at a time, which typically runs into a single thread limit if you're running a relatively fast Proxmox virtualization system and a relatively fast backup server, as ZSTD single-threaded can only compress so fast. So having multiple VMs being backed up at the same time would make it much faster, and since you can have multiple Proxmox hosts backing up to one PBS system at the same time, I know PBS is capable, so I'm curious how they could change that locking under the hood. Let me know if there's any other features in Proxmox virtualization or PBS backup software that you're curious about or would like to see added, and your overall experiences with the platform. Thanks for watching my little announcement on these updates, and let me know if you have any ideas for videos in the future. I've also been trying out the YouTube membership thingy, so there's a little join button below if you want to check out what I have, which includes things like early access to some of these videos, some behind-the-scenes content, which I will hopefully post more of in the future, and some polls and other information about what videos you want me to make in the future. Let me know if that seems like something I should keep working on or how I could possibly change that. Thanks for watching.